Dave Gash is here from Southern California. He's a veteran software developer with over 30 years of experience in documentation and training and development. He holds degrees in business and computer science and is an irresistible speaker at conferences in the U.S. and around the world. How many of you have seen Dave speak before? So you know how we couldn't resist having him back. Please, a warm welcome for Dave Gash.
Thanks, Em. All right, so let's have a quick show of hands here, please, one at a time. How many people here are application developers, programmers, application developers, engineers? That's it, all right. How about video producers? All right, I got one. Cartography experts. Animation artists. How about audio engineers? I've got a couple there. All right. How about living in your parents' basement? No? All right. Well, that's probably good because this presentation is not for those people. There are a lot of people who are in communication who do those kinds of jobs, but they aren't us. We do other things. We're content providers, and that's who this session is for. This is for those of us regular writing Joes who create and provide content for a living day in and day out. And, you know, the theme being all about change, what we're going to talk about today is the change forward between HTML4 and HTML5 and CSS2 and CSS3. But nothing terribly complicated. Marjorie asked me if there was going to be code in this presentation, and I replied by asking her, have you ever seen me present where you didn't get some code? And she said no, so that answers that. So,
I think because of that too.
So let's start with the current state of HTML5, all right? The first thing we're going to look at is some of the features that we don't care about, and then we'll look at some features that we do care about. And I'll show you an HTML4 to HTML5 transition page, and then we will look at some of the code in there. And we'll also see a bit of CSS, both 2 and 3. So that's where we're going here. Now, I'm not going to belabor this, but I want to make a point about it. This is the expected development path of HTML5, and you'll notice that it's not until next year that we even get to the candidate recommendation. And so you look at that and you think, W3CTF. Did anybody get that? Anybody? Thank you, Rebecca. All right. At least you're on top of things today. All right. So you think, God, that takes a long time, and you think that's completely insane that it would take that long to develop a specification. But it's really not that unusual because if you think about HTML4 originally was drafted in the early 90s, and so we're well 20 years past that. So that's kind of the way standards go. Also, it's really, really important to remember that useful and finished do not equate. Those are not the same thing. A thing does not have to be finished for it to be useful, and HTML5 is a shining example of that. There are many, many HTML5 features that are right now already supported by lots of browsers, lots of features that are available right now. And this brings up the question, at least I hope it's forming in your mind, wait a minute, what does he mean HTML5 features? Don't I just mean HTML5? Isn't HTML5 either supported or not supported? Well, no. And that's a big deal about HTML5 because it's not a thing. Hugely important if you don't take anything else from this presentation. Hugely important. HTML5 is not a thing. It's a whole boatload of things. It's a lot of things. Some things are core, I'll give you that. Some things are peripheral features, but it's not a thing. HTML5 is a bunch of stuff. Canvas, WebSockets, web workers, audio, video, geolocation. There's so many things that are part of HTML5, but not necessarily the core stuff. And here's what's interesting. A good example of this is local storage. I've done a presentation before about local storage, which is like cookies on steroids sort of thing. And the local storage feature was originally part of the HTML5 specification, but they took it out By they, I mean the W3C. The W3C took out the local storage specification out of the core spec and made it its own separate specification. You know why? I swear I'm not making this up. Because the HTML5 specification was getting too big. So they took a big piece of it out, didn't make it any smaller, it's just its own separate specification, and now the main specification isn't quite as big. One of the books that I recommend at the end here is a wonderful little book by a guy called Mark Pilgrim, and in that book, Mark has this quote: "If that sounds like slicing a pie into smaller pieces to reduce the number of calories, welcome to the wacky world of web standards." That's it. That's exactly what they did. They did not delete a single page of specification. They just took a big chunk out. So, does that mean that local storage is not a part of HTML5? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Of course it is. It's just its own separate specification now. Well, big whoop. But that's how specifications tend to work. So, what does that mean? What it means is that a lot of HTML5 features, a lot of features that we think are really pretty cool, are available now, but they're not particularly applicable to us as content providers. Again, you look at things like Canvas. Oh my God, Canvas. This is just a little aside. Canvas is the coolest freaking thing you have ever seen in your life. If you're a programmer. If you're a content provider and you write help manuals and so on for a living, it doesn't mean anything. Audio and video and geolocation, all these really cool features that are available, we don't care about them. They're just not important to us as everyday content providers. So we're not going to look at those at all. What we are going to look at is a set of HTML tags that focuses on content. We're going to look at tags that help us write better structured web pages, more semantic pages. And by web pages, of course, I mean manuals and documentation and help files and all the things that we write. We as writers concentrate on content that is reusable and extensible and readable and, of course, very importantly, writable, things that we can get down constructively. And HTML5 has a new set of elements, a new set of tags for that, and they're called semantic structural tags. We're going to look at those because those actually are important to us as content providers, as technical writers. Now, they're not the sexiest features. You know, it's not Canvas and it's not geolocation, which are admittedly really cool, but they are really, really useful. So, we're going to take a look at those first. Now, the reason for these new tags is because of semantics. And if we talk about semantics in HTML4, that's a really short conversation because there aren't any. There are practically no semantics attached to any of the HTML4 tags. We use divs for every bloody thing in an HTML4 page. Div, all the time we use divs for everything. They're functional, but they don't tell you anything about the content. What's inside the div is not in any way, shape, or form delineated by the fact that it's inside a div. It doesn't tell you anything. In fact, we call it divitis. Oh, but we do. When you have a page that's bloated with div after div after div without any semantic information, that's kind of what happens. They make our pages harder to construct and way harder to edit. If we have to come back later and edit our own pages, or, God forbid, somebody else has to come back and edit our pages, you can't make sense of the thing because it's div. And that's a problem. So the W3C recognized this, and that's one of the things that they tackled in HTML5 is how can we more semantically lay out our content in a page. And so that's how they came about with these new tags I'm going to show you. It's really hard to visualize how these divs are used. This might be a header. You don't know. It's a bloody div. You don't know what it is. This might be a footer, even though there's something below it. You don't know, because it's just a bunch of divs. That's hard to visualize, how elements are used, how the divs are used in an HTML4 page. Now, if we then change our conversation and we talk about semantics in HTML5, That's a significant conversation because semantics are all over the place in HTML5. So many tags, and what we're going to talk about, so many tags are semantically appropriate in HTML5 and convey information about the content of the tag. In doing this, the W3C took what is called the pave the cow paths approach. Have any of you heard of this? Thank goodness. Once again, Rebecca steps up. All right. And once again, I swear I didn't make this up. It's a real thing. It's called the pave the cow paths approach. And it came about when some universities, not necessarily in the United States, but I think certainly in the UK and elsewhere, when they put their buildings up, they neglected, on purpose, to put any sidewalks in. They didn't put any paved concrete sidewalks in. And the reason they did that was because they knew that they would get some of them wrong. And so what they did was they waited a year and they figured out, where do the students really walk? How do they actually get from building to building? And of course they wore the grass out where they actually did that. And so then the next year the union came in and said, oh, that's where they walk, and so that's what we'll pave. It's a simple but brilliant idea. The W3C took this approach in creating these new tags for HTML5. They took the pave the cow paths approach. It's also called desire paths or desire lines, but that's not as sexy a name as pave the cow paths. So they decided, we're going to find out what people call their divs. And to do that, they sent out their little electronic bots by the thousands, and they scanned millions and millions and millions of web pages. And they looked at our divs, yours and mine, the ones we actually write and put out there, in help systems, in user assistance, in manuals, in technical documents, in web pages, millions of pages. And they said, well, what people do is they make divs and give them IDs like article. I'm feeding back their article. Let me come over here. They write divs and they give them IDs like header, or they use CSS classes like aside and nav, and they found these IDs and classes out on the real web, the actual pages that you and I write, by the freaking billions. And they said, let's just make new tags that call them that. So they wrote some new tags called article, header, nav, aside, footer, all these things that we already use. And they paved the cow paths. I don't want to spend any more time on that, but I think that's just a brilliantly intuitive approach. They use things that you and I already know. We know what an article is. We know what a section is. We know what a header and a footer are. And that's what they did for us. They created new terms, new tags that we could use for the same things. All right. Now it becomes easy to picture how those tags are used. Now you can see that's a header and that's a footer and that's an aside because it's on the side. And you have sections with articles in. That's not just div now. Now you can look at that page, you can look at the structure of that page and infer from it what kind of content goes where. That's why they did this. Now, and this is a thing I said to Anya earlier, this is an important thing, that this is not, oh my God, this is radical, this is a whole new different kind of technology and coding. No, it isn't. It's just some new goodies to something that most of us already have some exposure to. So that's where we're going with the rest of this. Everybody okay so far? All right, now, I'm not going to read this table to you. Everybody go, thank you! Okay. I'm not going to read the table to you, but one thing I want to point out about this is these tags, these new tags, even though they impart a great deal of additional structure to our content, the tags themselves are not rigidly structured. By which I mean this. If I have a section and I want to put articles in that section, nest article inside section, I can do that. But if I have an article and it has sections in it, and I want to nest sections inside an article, I can do that. If I have a giant article, or let's say a section with articles in it, and I'd like to have a little sub-navigation section, I shouldn't say section, I want to have a little sub-navigation area inside the section that navs just inside that section, I can do that. It doesn't say I can only have one footer, I can only have one nav, I can only have one header, I can only have sections inside articles, or vice versa. It's flexible. I can do it any way I want to do it. Whatever makes sense, as long as I nest them properly, I can put the pieces where they need to go. I can have a big section with its own nav and its own articles, in addition to a nav for the entire page and a header and a footer and all this stuff. So these are very flexible tags. Okay, enough of that, moving on. Now, do not fall into the trap of thinking, oh boy, using these new HTML5 tags are going to make my pages look great. No, they won't. Why not? Because like any tag, like HTML4 or anything, you have to style the living bejeebus out of them to get them to look right. The tags don't do anything. Now, is that new? Everybody go like this. No, of course that's not new. Tags don't do anything. Again, we were talking about XML. Do those XML tags do anything? No, they just define what's between the start and end tags, just like HTML. The tags themselves don't produce any formatting. And if you think about it, the very fact that tags don't produce formatting is at the very heart of structured authoring. That's what it's all about. Because we say it a million times, you want to separate form from content, right? You hear it all the time, even from me. And that's true. So, the fact that the tags themselves don't generate formatting considerations on the page, that's a good thing, because that's what the CSS is for. That's what the styling is for. That means that it makes the content easier to use, easier to reuse, which is hugely important. Easier to read and easier for you and me to write, because we have semantic tags that we can use that when we go back and look at it a week from now or a month from now or 6 months from now, we look at our page and we go, oh, that's an article. Not, oh God, that's a div. I wonder what's in there. Done a million times. So much nicer. Now, let's talk a little bit about CSS3. CSS3 also has a lot of features that are totally awesome, by which I mean not particularly useful to us, and also browser specific, which I really mean not particularly useful to us. So as to not get completely crazy, we're going to stick with a small set of CSS features that I want to show you here. Rounded corners, text and image shadows, link nudging, you're going to like that, I guarantee. Drop caps and a fixed position div. And there I'm sort of using the word div generically there. A fixed position thing that we're going to look at. All right, and my timer says I have almost 40 minutes, so I think I may have rushed through part of that first part. Is everybody okay with what we've talked about conceptually before we really get to the code? Is everybody all right? Yeah. Speak to me.
The CSS3 defines the styling of the document. Is that what it is?
The question is, the CSS3 defines the styling of the content, of the HTML content, and that is exactly right, yes. If you have worked, for example, with Microsoft Word, and you use not only doc files, but dot files, everybody probably has done that. If you understand that relationship, that the docx files provide the styling for the doc file, then you already understand the relationship between CSS and HTML, because it's exactly that. It is exactly that. The CSS provides the styling information to the HTML. The HTML merely defines the content. It does not style the content. That's a very good question. Okay, so here's what we're going to do for the rest of this presentation. I have a web page out there that I had merely stolen from HTML5, the missing manual, but I use it with permission, so it's okay. This is the way the web page looks originally, over here on the left. It's got a header and a byline, and it's got some individual little articles here about a Mayan doomsday and a robot takeover, and it's sort of a whimsical page, not meant to be taken seriously. It's got a heading up here in a colored box, and so on and so forth. What we're going to do is we're going to take that page, which is currently coded in HTML4 with CSS2, and we're going to translate that to an HTML5 CSS3 page, which looks more like this. The main content, as you are going to find, is identical to this page. We're not going to change this page at all, really. We're just going to put HTML5 and CSS3 features on it. You'll see things like rounded corners here on the box, shadow there on that heading, a shadow on this image box. I'll show you the nudging links here, and you'll see the drop caps here on the first of the paragraphs. In fact, rather than just talk about it, so one last thing. This is how that page looks in code. It's div, 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 div. That's all it is. One div after the other, no semantic information at all. However, the other one is laid out like this. Instead of div, 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 it's header, section, article, aside, and so on and so forth. I can look at the code of this page, top down, and I can figure out what is supposed to go where, what content is meant to be contained inside an article. What do you suppose is inside an article tag? Don't get this wrong. Anybody? Bueller? An article is inside an article tag. My God, you guys like pulling teeth. Okay. Let's do one more. What do you suppose is inside a nav tag?
A navigation.
Thank you so much. All right. Good help is hard to find if you haven't noticed that. All right. So yes, the point there being these tags are semantic. They say what they are. Instead of just a div that might contain an article, or it might contain a header, or it might contain a nav bar, you don't know. You put your nav bars inside a nav tag. You put your articles inside an article tag. You put your header inside a header tag. Now, could you put navigation information not in a nav tag, but inside a header tag? Couldn't you do that? If you wanted to be a rat bastard, you could. Yeah, absolutely. But I wouldn't recommend doing that. That's a bad idea. Don't do that. Now, could I take a nav tag with navigation information and put that in a header? Yeah, absolutely. And that would make good sense, because you could look at that code and say, well, here's a header, it's got a banner, it's got some links in it or something. Oh, here's a navigation section for the whole page, and it's inside the header. Anything wrong with that? No. Perfectly acceptable. Okay. All right. So let's look at the genuine article here. If I can hit my little lightning bolt, we'll start up Firefox. At least I hope we will. Hey, Rhonda. Knock, knock. I'm sorry. I got no end of fun out of that. Okay, so here's our original page, and I'm even going to show you some of the HTML. Let's right-click and view the page source. Now, take a look at this page source. This is the HTML. Here's a div. Here's a div. Here's a div. Here is a div. Here's a div, div everywhere, div, div. The only possible clue as to what is in these divs is their CSS classes. And that's not ironclad. That's just a possible. So this is a perfectly good working HTML4 page, but it's got divitis. It's one div after another, and there's no way to tell what's in it. The div that contains this content here is exactly the same div as the div that contains this content. You just can't tell. So let's look at a better version. Here's the new one. Again, you'll see that we've got rounded corners on our box. A drop shadow on the header up here, drop shadow on the image. I don't know why I'm looking at that when I could look at this. We have nice styled headings here, and we've got these drop caps. On the left, we have a navigation area that stays put. You can see I can scroll the rest of the screen, and that nav stays put. And here it comes. We have something called nudging links. Look at these when I roll over them. Everybody go, ooh. That sucked. Do it again. Ooh. All right, good. That's very cool. I have done that kind of thing before with JavaScript, and it's a little messy, but it can be done. Guess how much JavaScript is involved in that? Don't get this wrong. Perfect. It's just a couple of lines of CSS, and it works like a charm. Very nice. All right, so let's look then at, I'll just clear that and leave that open for the moment. Okay, so let's look at some of this code then. How do we get that page without really modifying much of the content? How do we get that page from HTML4 to HTML5? Well, we begin at the code by simplifying the doc type. Doc types are one of the biggest headaches in HTML4. There's umpty-dumpty different kinds, and they all mean different things, and they all will validate against different DTDs. Here is a common HTML4 transitional doc type. It's correct, but holy crap, look at it. Does that make sense to you? No, me either. And I kind of know what it does, but only kind of. So, the HTML5 doc type is doc type HTML. And then you're done. That's it. Doc type, this is an HTML page. Really, what kind? I don't care. It's just an HTML page. That's your doc type. Piece of cake. You're done. All that stuff in red, boom, it's gone. Slick. That's pretty nice, eh? Just for a start. Simplify your doc type. Okay. Now, if you are at all concerned about Internet Explorer 8 and below, I didn't think so. Okay. You can add some code in there that will sort of patch things up for IE 8 and below, but I really don't care. And you probably don't either. So we'll skip that. All right. So we'll start at the doc type then. That simplifies the doc type for HTML4 to HTML5. Beautiful. Doc type HTML and you're done. That's all you have to say. All right. Next thing we will do is we'll go into our HTML4 page and we'll clean the head. Now, for those of you who have military backgrounds, that phrase may have a different connotation. But for me, oh good, somebody got that. But for me, to clean the head means to clean up some of the extraneous bits of stuff floating about in the head section of the HTML page. Again, all the stuff in red we can get rid of. It was a tiny fire. It was just a little bitty tiny fire. All right. So, for example, in your HTML declaration at the top, you used to have all this stuff, XML namespace and blah, 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 blah. And in HTML5, you don't have to do that at all. You just put HTML and you're ready to go. All the stuff in red can go away. In your meta tags, specifying the character set, UTF-8, for example, you used to have all of this stuff in red. Now you don't need that anymore. Much simpler stuff. If you look at some of the links, you know how you can include an external style sheet or an external JavaScript file with a link or a script tag. Well, previously you used to have to tell the link element what type of file you were importing. Well, that's silly. If it's a style sheet, it's a bloody text file. It's a CSS file in a text file. You don't have to tell it that anymore. You leave that out. You say, here's my style sheet. And finally, you used to have to tell a script tag what kind of script you were including from an external script file. It might be JScript, it might be VB script, or it might be a JavaScript. You don't have to say that anymore because the browsers are going to figure it out as soon as it imports it. So now you just say script down here in green, myscripts.js, and then imports it. So all I'm saying here is that the tags that are enclosed in the head section of your HTML page just got a lot simpler as well. Things you just don't have to bother with anymore. All right, more original HTML. Now, I keep talking about all these divs and classes, and that's true. If you look at these divs and classes that are in the HTML4 version of the page that I showed you a moment ago, you'll see they all have classes that at least kind of tell you what's meant to be in there. I have a div whose class is footer. Well, what do you reckon is in that? That better be a footer. It better not be a navigation section. And so that's kind of how we do it in HTML4. The rest of it is just standard HTML stuff, paragraphs and H2s and blah, blah. Also, if we look at the CSS, the original CSS, here are our classes, header, content, footer, and they just have normal CSS rules in them. Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, what's wrong with that? Doesn't that work? Yeah, it does. And what's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong with it is that the HTML doesn't tell you anything. Once again, could I put a bunch of navigation links inside a div whose class is content? I could. That would really bump things up, but I could do it. There is no semantic information about the content of the various divs that are in the page. You have to look at the content and then go look at the CSS and examine the classes in order to infer the structure. That's really hard to do. Also, the CSS is very non-specific. You may have noticed that it was mostly independent classes, by which I mean classes that start with a dot. Does anybody know the difference between independent and dependent classes in CSS? Somebody? Nobody? Okay. Well, how can I do this quickly? Dependent classes are more specific. Independent classes are more generic and therefore more error prone. Simple way to say that. So you may have noticed then, or if you didn't, let's go back. You'll see these classes start with a dot. That means those are independent classes and you can use them anywhere, which makes them a little bit loosey-goosey and a little bit prone to error. That's my point. So, also, even though the content and formatting are separate, the HTML is in a file, the CSS is in a file, that's fine. Even though those are separate, there's no real obvious relationship between them. And that's a thing that HTML5 and CSS3 sort of tend to fix. There is no semantic clues to the structure of the content in that old version of the page. And further, and this is just a personal bugaboo of mine, the class names are mixed case. If you look at these, there's a capital H there, and so on. CSS is case sensitive. HTML is not, but CSS is. Now, here's my feeling about case sensitivity. Remember, I started life as a programmer many moons ago. So I've seen programming languages and operating systems and style languages and markup languages of all kinds for decades. And here's my take on it. Anybody who would deliberately design a case-sensitive programming language or operating system or markup language should be dragged outside by the hair, stripped to the waist, tied to the nearest tree, and whipped until the tree dies. I'm not a fan. Not a fan of case sensitivity. It's a terrible idea. And for any of you who may program in JavaScript, you're probably aware of the term camel case, where you start with a lowercase word and then you uppercase it right in the middle. Makes me crazy. Don't do that. I think this is a supremely bad idea. Not just a bad idea, but really a magnificently bad idea. So, to me, that's a problem with that HTML and CSS, is that the CSS predominantly uses independent classes and they're mixed case. All right, so let's see how we can fix that. We can revise that HTML so that it looks better. Here, instead of div, we use mostly semantic elements. We have a header element. Guess what's in the header element?
Header.
Thank you. We have an aside, which is our navigation sidebar, and we even put a class on it that says nav sidebar, but it's an aside, inside which is the nav, inside which is a section. Remember, we can put sections inside articles or articles inside sections, whatever we think is appropriate. So that's all good because those elements are now semantic, they're not generic. Next, if we look at a little bit more of the semantic elements, you'll see they're mixed with regular elements. There's paragraphs and H2s and H3s and regular dot like you would normally write in HTML all over the place. That's fine. I'm not saying that these are the only elements you'll use. I'm saying you use them in addition to your normal HTML elements. All right? You'll see a new element there called figure that has fig caption in it. This is all good HTML5 stuff. All right? Also, I mentioned this already, but your nesting is not hardwired. It's not really restrictive. You can nest whatever way you think is appropriate. Here, for example, is an aside that contains a nav section. That's because we put the nav over here at the aside. Could we have put that nav section inside the header across the top? Yeah, sure it could. Any way you want to do it. We chose to put everything over here and then make that div stand by itself. Make that aside, not scroll. We scroll the rest of the page. Also, you'll notice I have gleefully used all lowercase class names here instead of capital C for content. Once again, that's just me. Here we have an article in which is an aside. And that's a pull quote. Oh, and I should have scrolled down a little further. I'll show that to you in a moment. There's a pull quote in there that is inside an aside tag and used for a specific thing. It has big quotes above it and after it. All right, and what? Yep. Rebecca.
Going back to that previous one, could you have had your nav with the class nav sidebar, say, and therefore not actually have to put your nav in an aside, but have your CSS file decide that it went to the side?
I think the question was, could I have just avoided this aside entirely and have a nav section there whose class was nav sidebar and had the CSS style it exactly the same way as I did for the aside? And that answer is yes, absolutely. The implication here is that there is other stuff inside the aside besides the nav. And so I style the entire aside that way. But the answer to that is absolutely yes. I could have just not had the aside at all, put the class on the nav, and then style the nav the way I wanted to do it. Rhonda.
But if you're going with what Tony said about the responsive web design, by having it within the aside, it means that you can then tell in the responsive web design where to put that aside. It doesn't have to be on the left-hand side, and it's encapsulated and it stays with it. So it may end up at the bottom of the page on a small device, or at the top of the page, but you would say in your media query for that sort of, for that particular tag, you tell it where you wanted to go for that particular media query. In my understanding.
All correct. Did everybody hear Rhonda? Pretty much? Okay, that's absolutely correct. For responsive web design, you can define how that aside is supposed to act, and then everything inside it, including the nav, will behave that way. So that's a good way to look at it. Okay, so again, notice this is not all wildly brand new technology. The new CSS is similar to the old CSS, and the new HTML is similar to the old HTML. It's just got some new stuff in it. One thing, or two things that I did here was, first of all, in my new CSS, again, I made all my class names lowercase so that I didn't have that nasty little bug waiting to leap up and bite me in the bum because, oh, I can't find that class because it's a capital C. So I got rid of that. And second, I used almost exclusively dependent classes instead of independent classes. Like this, aside dot nav sidebar. That says you can't just apply the class nav sidebar to just any old tag in the page. It will only apply to an aside whose class is nav sidebar. That's the difference between dependent and independent classes. Again, they both work, but dependent classes are a little more restrictive, and you want that. They're restrictive in your favor. They work in your favor when they're more restrictive. The other ones, independent classes, are a little more loosey-goosey and they're accident prone. You can easily apply a class to, say, an H1, and you'll look at your page and think, what the hell is that? Because it'll look crazy because it will apply a class to some element you didn't intend for it to apply to. And you can prevent that by using dependent classes, where you have a tag, dot, and a class name. Okay, so that's that. Also, and I guarantee if you didn't know dependent and independent classes, you probably also don't know contextual selectors, but that's another thing that I've done down here. Notice there's no dot there. Contextual selectors says, I want you to apply this style to an H3, but only if you find it inside an article. If you find an H3 somewhere else, don't mess with it. That's just a contextual selector. It says if you find an H3 and it's in the context of an article, then apply this style. Really, really handy contextual selectors. So, I basically cleaned up my CSS and made it a little bit stricter, just a little bit more hardwired to apply to the pieces of HTML that I want to use. And done things like used dependent classes, lowercase class names, and where there's no dot, that's a descendant or contextual selector. All right. I really like contextual selectors, and I can kind of get off on a tangent, but you don't want me to do that today. Contextual selectors in CSS are really powerful and very slick, and they're so easy to use. So once you catch on to those, you will like them. All right, so again, let's look at some of the new goodies now that we added into that HTML5 page that I showed you, the new version with all the extra new stuff. Here, inside an H1 that happens to be inside a header, we added a new CSS3 property called text shadow. Unsurprisingly, that puts a shadow on your text. You would have thought we could have done that 20 years ago, but it's really simple now though, text shadow, boom. And you tell it what the size of the shadow is, what direction it's supposed to go, what color it's supposed to be, and voila, you get a shadow on your text. It's really nice. You used to have to do that with graphics. You had to turn your heading into a graphic and put it in, do it like with word art or something, or PowerPoint, and then capture that and then make the, I know, right? That's brutal. All right. Then, we also added that little picture in the center of the screen, and the picture also has a shadow around the box. That's done with a new CSS property called, not surprisingly, box shadow. And again, you tell it where you want the shadow, how thick you want it, which direction it should go, and what color it should be. All right, so all 8s is a little bit lighter than all 5s. And once again, see, hexadecimal colors, that's another thing I can talk for an hour about, but you don't want me to. All right, so some more goodies. Let's talk about the rounded corners and the link nudging. Now, the rounded corners, as it turns out, this is also something that we've done for years and years with graphics. And then it turned out there were ways to do it with JavaScript, with like painting pixels on the screen. Don't want to do that. Nasty. Now, there's a wonderful CSS3 property called border radius, and you play with those values until you get the curvature that you want on a div. You set a background color and set the border radius, and voila, rounded corners. People who have done this with JavaScript for years go, oh my God, where's that been? Because it's just so simple now. You say border radius and you define the curve and bang, you got a nice rounded corner on a box. How hard was that? Pretty hard, apparently. For the link nudging, that requires 2 lines of CSS, 2 different things. One is, it's almost like a joke. It's like a setup and a punchline. You have to set up the transition that you want. I want to add padding on the left to nudge the link out. And I want to do that in a quarter of a second, 250 milliseconds. And I want to use a special kind of transition called an ease out, which is what you saw. It doesn't go wham and slam over against the margin. It kind of eases out and eases back in. Those are just the names that you use. That's the setup. And then the punchline is, when do you want that to happen? When do I want to trigger that link to nudge over like it did visually? Well, I want to do that when I hover over it with the mouse. And that's using the CSS pseudo class hover on a link. So a:hover says, when you hover over this link, I want you to do the little nudge thing. And you tell it that by adding 20 pixels to the left padding, which triggers the transition, which eases it out and eases it back in. 2 lines of code, really simple. Once again, I've done those kinds of things with JavaScript before. It took, a page of code, no more. So that's a little CSS3, couple of goodies that you can use. Very easy to do. In the new in the new HTML5 CSS3 page, there are some old CSS2 favorites as well, like first letter. You remember the drop caps that I got at the beginning of every paragraph? I showed you those. I'm going to show you all this again before we close up. You do that with a pseudo class called first letter. And so this says if you find a paragraph, and the paragraph is inside an article, apply the first letter rule to it that does this. Well, what is that? Well, it says use times, to apply Times Roman to the first letter, make it 200% the size, float it to the left, and give it a little margin to push the rest of the text away from it. That's just plain old vanilla CSS. Nothing fancy about that at all. But this is the guy right here that does the trick and creates that first letter drop cap for you. We're all familiar with drop caps in print. They look pretty good. They don't necessarily add any information, but readers like them. Readers like drop caps, and so it becomes really easy to add. The other one is the non-scrolling element. Remember over on the left of the page I had that aside which contained my nav and the Lucky Strikes commercial at the bottom and so on. And remember I could scroll the rest of the page and that nav stayed where it was. Oh my God, how hard was that? Not. All I had to do was add position fixed to my CSS rule for the nav sidebar that defines the aside. And again, as Rebecca pointed out, notice what that's on. That's not on the nav tag, it's on the aside tag. All right, all I had to do was add position fixed to that, and it works like a charm. So that's the way that I revised my HTML4 to HTML5 and my CSS2 to CSS3. Even though some of these things, as I say, are plain old vanilla CSS2, not fancy at all. All right, so that's enough of that. Let's see the real thing again, and let's take a look at a little bit of the code. You probably don't need to see the code for this because you've already seen it, and B, it's just HTML4. But you'll notice what it's missing. It's missing the drop caps and the styling and the rounded corners and the shadows and all that good stuff. So let's look at this. Once again, here's our rounded corners on the header. And here is the drop shadow on the heading, and drop shadow right here on the image. Here's our drop caps. There's the other pull. There's the pull quote, which is also an aside. This is in an aside tag, but it's styled differently from this aside tag over here. That aside has the nav in it. The other aside only has the pull quote in it. 10 minutes, all right. And so all I did was style them differently. So it'll be aside, well, we can look at it, I guess. And then last, there's our little groovy pop-out links. Okay, so here is the aside that contains the nav bar. Right here. So the tag is aside, but the class is nav sidebar. But down here, for our pull quote, this is also an aside tag, but a different class. All right, so the class is applied to the text inside the pull quote to make it look different from the text inside the nav, which is in the other aside. Am I making sense, or am I just making up words now? Okay. I know, you're about done, and so am I. So, that's probably enough of that. So let's close up here. Hello? Oh, I clicked on the graphic, which opened the browser. I'm sorry. All right. That's better. All right, so let's close up. Too clever for my own good. All right, so HTML5 and CSS3 it's not a thing. It's a whole bunch of things, and a lot of those things are ready for use now. Some things are not really ready for prime time yet. They're still being developed, and they may not be ready for browsers to implement for another year or 2 or 3. Who knows on some of those things. But a lot of the features are ready for use right now, and the benefits can be seen immediately. You can start using them on your own. You can start using HTML5 output in your help authoring tools and so on. It's never too soon to jump on. HTML5 is not a panacea nor a pancreas or anything like that. It is, however, really useful and something that we can all use and gain benefit from straight away, rather than saying, well, that's something I should learn about and we'll use that in another year or 2. No, start using it right now. It's a huge practical step forward in web page and help and documentation design. Again, CSS3 as well is also not a new styling concept. as I said earlier, if you understand how a dot file works with a Word doc file, then you already understand how CSS works with HTML. It's literally, absolutely the same concept. And if you understand that, then you understand how CSS3 and HTML5 work, because it's not a great big brand new deal. It's the same thing. And I always try to say this in my presentations, because if ever I have lived by any philosophy, it's this one. Anytime you can get smarter, that's good. Anytime you can get some dingleberry to pay you to get smarter, that's great. It doesn't get any better than that. Then you all are all here because some dingleberry is paying you to get smarter, and that's wonderful. So every time you learn something, you always take that with you. Nobody can ever take that away. I don't care whether it seems useful at the time or not. And so learning new stuff is good for your brain. It's good for your users, it's good for your company that you work for, and it'll be good for the next company that you work for. And nobody can ever take that from you. So I always make that point because it's really, really important. Try to learn whatever you can, whenever you can, and move forward and embrace change. So, about done here. Some of the resources that I recommend. Mark Pilgrim's book, HTML5 Up and Running. That's the one where he had the funny quote about wacky world of web standards. That's a good one. There's a whole series called the Missing Manual books, and they're written by different authors. The one for HTML5 is Matt McDonald, and CSS3 is written by Dave McFarlane. These are both good books. And, Visual Quick Start. Anybody familiar with the Visual Quick Start series? They're the ones, generally, they're kind of mustard and purple color with a little white bunny rabbit in the corner. If you've seen those, they're all really good. The thing I like about the Visual Quick Start series is they're not big on exposition. The Visual Quick Start series says, how do I do this? Here's some code. Bang, next subject. And it's over. But they don't, spend a lot of time, page after page, explaining why to do it and how it works and blah, blah. They say, here's the thing that a lot of people want to do. And you go, yeah, I'd like to do that. And the next paragraph is, here's the code. And the paragraph after that is the next subject. I mean, they're just done. And so they move right along. I really like the Visual Quick Start guides. These are not like, tutorial type books. But when you're working on something and you go, man, I wish I could do such and such, you look it up in your Visual Quick Start guide. It'll tell you, and you'll be back to work in 5 minutes. That's the thing about that particular series. They're really good. Okay, so I think I'm done. Hope you enjoyed the session. Hope you learned something. Do remember to fill out your evaluations that are in your books. These are important for the conference, so that they know what subjects are good and what speakers are good and not so much, and so on. Are they 1 to 5? Is that kind of how the ratings are, Em?
Take a look.
Yeah, I hadn't looked at it.
Yep.
Okay. So 1 is low to 5 is high. I'm assuming.
5 is my favorite number, so I'm going to say yes.
Okay, right, exactly. So, and Emily may get on me for telling you this, but I'm going to tell you a little secret about conference evaluations. Remember, I've done this a long, long time. There's a secret to filling in conference evaluations. When you go to fill in the one for me, here's the deal. You just circle 1, 5. You don't circle things individually. You just make one big oval around the 5s and you're done. So it's really quick and easy to do. So, sorry about that. But anyway, that's how you do it, especially when you get to my sessions. All right. Let's see. Tony's not in here. So Tony and I are doing trivia tonight, so you don't want to miss that. And I have a session tomorrow as well, so you may not want to miss that. That's the embedded help session that I tried to give you this week. I have never done that before. I'm glad somebody caught me. Thanks, Rebecca.
It's so good, you just couldn't wait.
It was so good, I could not wait for tomorrow. So anyway, that's it. And I'll be around. Feel free to ask me questions at any time. I think I'm about out of time, actually.
We are about out of time. It's time for afternoon tea.